Today, we're diving into an absolutely pivotal story about power, faith, and yeah, failure. It's a classic tale of how one king can lose it all and how a totally overlooked shepherd boy gets secretly chosen to take his place.
So let's just start with a question that gets right to the point. What single mistake can cost a king his throne? For King Saul of Israel, the answer wasn't, a lost battle or some big political scandal. Nope, it was a test of simple obedience.
So here's the setup. You've got King Saul, the guy God himself chose to lead Israel, and he gets a direct order from the prophet Samuel. Now this isn't just another royal duty on his checklist, this is it. It's a final, high-stakes test of his loyalty, and pretty much everything is hanging in the balance.
And let me tell you, the command is severe. It is absolute. Saul is ordered to go after the Amalekites, a people considered enemies of Israel for centuries, and to totally destroy everything. We're talking men, women, children, all of their livestock. There is absolutely no wiggle room here.
And this is where it all goes wrong. It's just so clear when you see it side by side. On one hand, you've got the command, total destruction. On the other hand, Saul's actions. He spares their king, Agag, and he keeps the very best of their sheep and cattle. He obeyed, kinda. And as we're about to see, kinda obedient is just plain disobedient.
So when the prophet Samuel shows up to confront him, Saul actually says, "Hey, I did it. I carried out the Lord's instructions." But Samuel's response is just brilliant. He doesn't need a witness. The evidence is making noise all around them. This one question just cuts through all the excuses. Saul's defense is a masterclass in trying to sound religious to cover your tracks. He argues, "Oh, I didn't keep the best animals for myself. I saved them for a huge, awesome sacrifice to honor God." He's basically trying to tell God that his plan for honoring him is actually better than the one God commanded in the first place. And this is Samuel's legendary reply, the absolute heart of this whole story. God isn't impressed by big, flashy religious shows, especially when they're just a cover for a disobedient heart. The point is crystal clear. God wants your obedience way more than your performance.
Now, okay, that command to destroy everyone, it sounds incredibly harsh to us today, and it is. Some theologians, like Dr. Robert Chisholm, offer a bit of context. From the Old Testament view, God, as the creator, has the final say on life. Plus, there's this idea of corporate identity, where a whole nation was seen as one single unit. Think about a sports team. When they win a championship, the person who sat on the bench all year still gets a ring. The whole team shares the outcome. In this view, the Amalekites were being judged as one entity for their history of wickedness.
So when all his religious excuses fall apart, the truth finally tumbles out. It wasn't about piety. It wasn't about sacrifice. Saul's failure came down to one thing: fear. He was more afraid of what his soldiers would think, more afraid of losing popular approval, than he was of disobeying a direct command from God. And then you get this incredibly dramatic, symbolic moment. In total desperation, Saul grabs onto Samuel's robe, and it rips. Samuel, being a prophet, doesn't miss a beat. He immediately uses it as a real-life object lesson, saying, "Just like that robe tore, the Lord has torn the kingdom away from you today." A physical act showing a spiritual reality. There's no coming back from this. So, Saul is out. What's next? Well, the story immediately pivots. Samuel is sent on a secret and, frankly, pretty dangerous mission. He has to go to Bethlehem to find Saul's replacement. But this time, the job description is totally different. They're not looking for another tall, impressive-looking guy. They're looking for a man after God's own heart.
So Samuel gets to this guy Jesse's house, and the first son to walk out is Eliab. And wouldn't you know it, he's tall, he's impressive, he looks the part. He's basically Saul 2.0. And even Samuel, the great prophet, falls right into the trap. He takes one look and thinks, yep, this has got to be him.
But God immediately shuts that down with one of the most famous lines in the entire Bible. This is the new gold standard for leadership. It's a direct challenge to our very human tendency to be impressed by the packaging. God's saying, you're all looking at the outside, I'm looking at what's on the inside. And so begins this kind of awkward parade of sons. One by one, they're brought before Samuel. Eliab? Nope. Abinadab? Not him either. Shammah? Still no. 7 sons walk by, and every single one is rejected. You can just imagine the tension and confusion building in that room. Finally, Samuel has to ask,
hey, are you sure this is all the sons you have? And Jesse basically says, well, there is the youngest, David, but he's out watching the sheep. Just think about that. He was considered so unimportant that his own dad didn't even bother to call him in for the king-choosing ceremony.
And here's a fascinating little twist in the story. Right after we get this big lesson that appearance doesn't matter, David shows up, and the text goes out of its way to tell us he's good-looking. So what gives? This probably isn't a contradiction. It's more like narrative tension. Yes, God chose him for his heart, but that handsome exterior could absolutely become a temptation for him and for the people down the road.
The moment David arrives, the search is over. The command from God is immediate and clear. Rise and anoint him. This is the one. And so right there, in front of all his probably shocked older brothers, the young shepherd boy is secretly anointed with oil, marking him as the next king of Israel.
And this slide just sums it all up perfectly. This wasn't just a political handover, it was a spiritual one. At the exact moment the Spirit of God departs from Saul, leaving him tormented, that same Spirit comes powerfully upon David. The divine favor has officially been transferred.
So this ancient story leaves us with a really modern question, doesn't it? When we choose our leaders, in any part of life, what are we really looking for? Do we go for the impressive exterior, the one who just looks the part? Or do we look for the proven heart, for real character? And maybe the trickiest question of all, what happens when the two look exactly the same? It's a tension that's absolutely worth thinking about.